Comedy is a performance. Well, it's a lot of things, frankly, but in most of its incarnations, I would describe it as performative, with all the connotations that come with the word. It doesn't have to be that way per se, it's not a hard and fast rule, but to the layman, that is to you and to me and to anyone who doesn't produce or direct comedy on a regular basis, the bulk of the comedy that we consume is performative. Either we watch comedy be performed, or we perform comedy ourselves and expect those to whom we perform to laugh. Laughter is a lot of fun, or so I've been told. It's essential to me, at least. It is a vital part of who I am and who I strive to be, and as such I find myself on an insatiable quest for comedy. That is, for irony. Because comedy, at its core, at its very essence, is irony. Irony is a subversion of expectation. It is the breaking of a norm or a well-established rule. Every joke you have ever heard and ever will hear has been, is, and always will be an instance of irony, an affront to normalcy. So what does that mean? Is that a big deal? Does that make comedy important or sacred or something? Well, not really. No, comedy's just a rhetorical device like any other, but it manages to show up an awful lot. And by an awful lot, I mean everywhere. Social media is an endless gauntlet of people trying to carve their comedic niches into your timeline, and most streaming services employ stand-up comedy as the core feature of its platform. Comedy is pervasive, sure, but that's a good thing, right? I mean, it ought to be a neutral thing if comedy is just a rhetorical device, but it's hard to feel that way because of the way that comedy makes us feel, because it makes us laugh. But I understand that comedy can hurt. Of course, I wish it didn't. After all I want is for people to laugh as much as I do. So what does it mean when someone can't laugh? What does it mean for someone to feel so targeted or vulnerable or uncomfortable that they can't take pleasure in a joke? What does that mean for the comedian? What does that mean for the audience? Well, I figure we ought to get to the bottom of that. Shall we?
I want to start off by dispelling something right off the bat before it has a chance to fester in your mind. Comedy and misery have very little to do with one another. Some folks will claim that comedy has its roots in misery or superiority or even worse, schadenfreude. But to rely on that connection is to imply something really insidious about comedy. Schadenfreude is the pleasure that we derive from seeing someone fail. It's a morbid pleasure. It's probably not the most healthy one to indulge, but I'd be hard-pressed to say I don't see the appeal. Schadenfreude at its least toxic can be the feeling of witnessing justice. But the laughter we derive from observing the pain of, say, slapstick, actually comes from a lot of different places. The sheer exaggeration of motion is one. Another is the disconnect between what we see and what we hear. When Charlie Chaplin rides through the gears of the machine in modern times, we don't laugh at the misery of his predicament. Rather, we watch him snake between the gears and flex in uncomfortable and bombastic ways. The irony is that this motion is absurd and something you'd never see, yet it's the logical way Chaplin ought to move through that system of gears. The exaggeration of movement, in a way, makes sense. The third appeal of slapstick, and this is an important one, is someone who doesn't deserve violence or misfortune being subject to it anyway. There's an inherent violence in someone who doesn't deserve pain falling prey to it regardless. It's a fine line between this irony and just laughing at the idea of someone in pain, but that distinction is really important if we're to avoid the idea that comedy is dependent by its nature on harm. If you've managed to clear that hurdle with me, then I'm glad, but I'm afraid we still have a few more. In fact, today we're talking about all the subtle and not-so-subtle ways that comedians, audiences, all of us, can end up hurting someone when we perform. Perhaps I've been speaking in the abstract for too long. After all, what does it mean to hurt someone with a joke?
Let's get the easy stuff out of the way first. The easiest way for a joke to harm is for it to unambiguously disparage, and this is usually pretty easy to spot. The obvious examples are racist and sexist humor, but all too often we see less represented, marginalized groups thrown under the bus rather bluntly as well. Most jokes about Tourette syndrome, for example, label its tics as disturbing or obtrusive, a nuisance. Most jokes about fatness label it as unsightly or a burden. Disfigurement is usually the joke itself. Man looks different. Most of these instances are written by folks who are actively trying to promote a kind of hierarchy, or at least believe in one, that is, fat and disabled people below thin and able-bodied people, for example. But that's not us, right? We're not out to get anyone. That would be kind of silly and frankly uncalled for. So say you don't want to hurt anyone per se. You just want to identify someone or something as different. Not bad, but different.
If irony is the crux of comedy, not as a medium, mind you, but as a rhetorical device, then comedy is doing something very important. It is unambiguously drawing a line between what is status quo and what is subversion, what is expected and what is unexpected, what is normal and what is other. In the hands of satirists, comedy can undermine dominant power structures by pointing out their hypocrisies and failings.
There's a catch. A catch? Sure, catch-22. Anyone who wants to get out of combat isn't really crazy, so I can't ground him.
In the hands of fascists, comedy can paint one in-group as ideal and the rest as incorrect or suboptimal. That sounds like a lot of responsibility all of a sudden. Sounds like something you could mess up really easily if you went about it wrong.
So what's the deal with otherness, then? Why does other always seem to equate to wrong? Or at least why do we perceive it to be that way? Well, chalk it up to biology or psychology or human nature or what have you, but we have an aversion of the other, of those who are not like us. It's a fear of the unknown at its core, really, but the more different something is, the less likely you are to know it.
And most of the time, this fear of the unknown ends up being completely unwarranted. Most of us understand that the color of someone's skin, the shape of their body, the features of their face, ought to have nothing to do with how we treat them or think about them. It's a non-issue on paper, but I hope you can see how this kind of othering gets used to elevate one group of people above another all the time. The scars of oppression run deep, and they're being torn open again on a near daily basis.
So let's not keep the definition vague here, of a different or other. Different from what, exactly?
The cop-out answer is the average human, which falls apart when you get a glance at how wide the distribution curve is for things like height, weight, etc., and how difficult it really is to quantify and qualify instances of neurodivergence. The real, more insidious answer to the question is the ideal human, but those who claim the answer is the former end up inadvertently appealing to the latter.
The most common targets of this kind of othering include the disabled, fat, gender nonconforming, and neurodivergent, and especially in the more out-of-touch corners of the internet, non-white and female. Who am I kidding? Those are everywhere too.
The word uncanny is worth bringing up here as well. For those of you familiar with the uncanny valley, you already know that the closer something gets to a human being, the more subtle its differences, the more unnerving or frightening it can ultimately be.
I see uncanny as a sort of double subversion of expectation. The thing you think is different is actually quite similar, or the thing you think is similar still feels quite different. The otherness of something uncanny is that same fear of the unknown, but amplified, in spite of the subject's attempt to appear normal. In this way, diametrical opposition is almost less frightening than near perfection.
And unfortunately, this uncanniness is exploited when it comes to folks like the disfigured, disabled, and the neurodivergent. Their representations in media are almost always disparaging or meant to inspire fear or pity. The neurodivergent have an especially tough break when characters are written to exhibit particular neurodivergent traits on accident by a team of neurotypical writers.
Penny, I told you if you don't put him in his crate at night, he just runs around the apartment.
We recognize that this kind of othering exists, of course, and the solution is actually pretty simple. Just don't attack those who ought not to be attacked. Easy enough, right?
So perhaps you don't want to other anyone per se. You simply want to talk about those kinds of experiences that those marginalized groups endure. You don't want to condemn or condone them overtly, of course. They're implied to be negative experiences. You simply want to turn something bleak into something helpful, something that might even help people heal, like laughter. So what then? I'm going to tell you a particularly bad joke, so bear with me. What's the worst thing about being a black Jew? You have to sit in the back of the oven. It's a bad joke and a harmful joke, let me be totally clear. But for me, at least, that wasn't always particularly obvious. So let's break down the joke. The joke is an instance of wordplay. It links two unrelated instances of oppression into one quick, off-the-tongue quip. The back of the oven. It's a reference to both the Holocaust and Jim Crow-era transit segregation, and the joke neither condones nor condemns those things. The theme of the joke is simply, the Holocaust and transit segregation happened, with no other commentary, at least within the text itself. The theme of the text isn't harmful per se, after all a decent history textbook will tell you the same thing, so it at least clears the first hurdle. It doesn't laugh at black people or Jews for being different, so it clears the second. So where does it falter? Well, it fails as a performance. I am a cis white male. If I kept my mouth shut and my politics to myself, I could have gotten along just fine in Nazi Germany. When I tell a joke like that, I'm using the plight of both Jewish people and black people as a punchline. It's not that there isn't a joke there, but to tell that joke is to, as a relatively privileged person, use the plight of other people for personal gain, whether that's to make people laugh, or to make myself feel clever, or to satiate some basic desire to create art. Okay, so that begs the question, can a black person make that joke? Or a Jew? Or only a black Jew? Well, I'm not the authority on that per se, but I would answer that question with a resounding Let's talk about advocacy.
All artists are advocates, whether they choose to be or not. It's painfully easy to think of a dozen movies with only one actor of color who ends up acting as a representative for all people of color in their absence. Writers, directors, and crew are all advocates in their own right, but more often than not, we tend to focus on the performers, because they're who we see on screen and on stage. This is especially the case for stand-up comedy, in which a single person writes and performs their own material. When a comedian goes on stage, unless they specify otherwise, they will be seen as an advocate for every group that makes up their identity. Sometimes this advocacy results in some accidental othering. Zach Anner is a comedian with cerebral palsy who uses his disability as a springboard to raise awareness with comedic videos and vlogs. His vlog, Workout Wednesdays, has Anner performing all kinds of workout routines and inevitably doing a poor job due to his cerebral palsy. All the while, he shouts words of motivation so that you, the viewer, can feel empowered to exercise. In a Reddit AMA, Anner describes his conception of the show as such. I realized that every fitness show that I watched had some guy that was extremely buff just yelling at you to work harder. I thought it would be funny to do a show with the premise of people working out so that they could have a body like mine, and telling them that they were doing great the whole way through. The show comes from a place of love, and Anner is all about using self-deprecation to motivate others. Self-deprecating humor is pretty commonplace. It's a great way to look both humble and witty at the same time, and a good self-deprecating joke makes everyone feel that much better about themselves. It's easy to pull off, and no one can be offended because you're only disparaging yourself, right? Well, self-deprecating humor is one of the safest forms of humor out there, but when you're representing not just yourself, but all the communities that you're a part of, you might not be the only butt of the joke. What seems like a harmless introspection can actually come across as an appeal to the kind of hurtful norms that we talked about earlier. A lot of black comedians in particular have had to reconcile with their critiques of black culture, as well as their use of the most prominent racial slur, the N-word. Richard Pryor himself abandoned the word after using it for several years, citing fears that the connotations of the word clung to his work. There's a lot of great work out there about the appropriation and reclamation of racial slurs, but that process is a gradual one, and one that ought to be consensual, especially considering all the people who have been hurt by those slurs in the past and find it impossible to disassociate that trauma from the slur. There's a fine line to be drawn between racial humor and racist humor, But all too often, a racial joke handled badly can be perceived as racist. It's a craft all on its own. So what if you manage to plan for all of those contingencies? You write a joke that speaks truth to power, acknowledges your stakes in the joke, and your responsibilities to both the audience and the subject matter, and it's knee-slappingly funny. Well, there's still one more hurdle to clear, and it's a big one.
Trauma, as I will refer to it, is any kind of negative response to a stimulus, be that a word or an action or a joke, that finds its roots in a prior negative experience. Trauma brings discomfort, pain, sadness, and vulnerability in varying magnitudes. Trauma can be totally debilitating in the case of PTSD, or minor trauma can be almost negligible. Some more obvious triggers are things like sexual assault, violence, abuse, and discrimination, but I hope it's clear that these traumas can come from anywhere. Anything can be a trigger. It just happens to be that things like sexual assault and violence are that much more pervasive. Any joke that frankly discusses sexual assault is likely to elicit trauma in survivors. It doesn't matter how potent the joke is or how many people laugh. But why would you laugh at a joke about rape, even one with an anti-rape theme, if any time you hear overt discussion of sexual assault, you are forced to recollect your trauma? It's not that you don't understand the joke as ironic or valid or even constructive. It's simply that you're just too busy dealing with your recollected trauma. That's not to mention, if you're in a comedy club or among a group of peers, you are recollecting that trauma while everyone around you laughs. Very few moments can feel more isolating than that. You don't make dead baby jokes to couples who have experienced miscarriages or infant mortality. You don't make rape jokes to sexual assault survivors. Despite your best intentions, you will elicit some amount of trauma. That much is intuitive. But that's true for all forms of communication. Comedy isn't really the exception there. But I would argue that comedy in particular thrives on trauma for a couple of reasons. The most obvious one is that there is another separate irony, a joke within a joke, if you will, at laughing at something you've been told you ought not to laugh at. The dissonance is obvious, and it might make you laugh even harder at an edgy, dark, or offensive joke. In fact, if the trauma isn't completely overwhelming, you may find it ironic that you're laughing at something that hurts you, or at least recalls a time in which you were hurt. For example, my grandmother's funeral program had a misprint that said she died at the age of 213. It's a blemish on an otherwise somber occasion and will always be a source of trauma for me, but the sheer absurdity of the misprint is funny enough that my family and I can look back and laugh. Laughing at taboo is reflexive, and I would argue it's why we take such great pleasure in edgy or dark comedy in the first place. Joan Rivers performed a stand-up routine in which she made fun of Helen Keller for being mute as a child. The father of a deaf son interrupted the performance to tell her the joke wasn't funny to him. Rivers retorted that she had a deaf mother and that comedy ought to help you cope with your traumas rather than provoke them.
The only child that I think I would have liked ever was Helen Keller, because she didn't talk. It is just...
It's very funny.
Yes, it is. And if you don't, then leave.
It's funny if you have a deaf son.
I happen to have a deaf mother. Oh, you stupid ass. Let me tell you what comedy is about.
Go ahead and tell me.
Oh, please. You are so stupid. Comedy is to make everybody laugh at everything and deal with things, you idiot. My mother is deaf, you stupid son of a bitch.
Comedy, like any other piece of art, can be a method by which people cope with their trauma. That much is obvious. But watch Lindsay Ellis's video on Mel Brooks if you'd like to get some insight on that. The caveat here is that this ought to be consensual, because that's not a universal truth, and folks ought not be confronted with their trauma until they're good and ready. Of course, you go to see a comedian and you generally have a sense of what you're going to see, but you can't prepare for everything. Trauma thrives in comedy. Otherness thrives in comedy. Even fascism can thrive in comedy. So what do we do about it?
If you take today's video at face value, it sounds like you ought not to joke about anything. In fact, it sounds like you ought not to even try to communicate if the threat of trauma can exist in anything you say or do.
But I hope it's clear that that's not the answer, that the MO going forward is not to simply not make jokes. I think there's an intuition that can be developed here, and I'd like to suss that out with the information that we have.
Say for the sake of argument that 0.005% of the population has some horrifyingly traumatic experience involving slipping on a banana peel. Now, it doesn't invalidate their trauma, but making a joke about it isn't going to get you hauled off stage either. It's simply too fringe a case to conjure any meaningful uproar. Now consider, on the other hand, that 1 in 6 women has experience with sexual violence. And that's not even mentioning that the frequency of that sexual violence comes down to some pretty terrifying societal problems. In theory, there might be some sort of sweet spot between trauma and humor, but that also involves labeling some people acceptable losses, which isn't something I'm comfortable accepting. Trying to treat comedy and people's well-being as some sort of numbers game is maybe not the most comfortable solution to come to here.
A handy metaphor here, I think, is driving. Everybody needs to drive, but every time you go out, you run the risk of hurting someone. So what do? Well, you follow some guidelines that have been established to make sure that no one gets hurt. Where you're headed, you pay attention on the road, and you adjust accordingly. You can play a little fast and loose on an empty desert road where there aren't so many people, but on a busy highway you ought to keep your wits about you and play it safe. And most importantly, if someone is hurt, you stop, you pull over, and you make sure that they're taken care of, because no one's well-being is more important than whatever joke you're trying to tell. Let's review with an old adage that I think will sum up this video pretty well. Can you make a rape joke? Yes, you can make a joke about anything you like. That's not what anyone is arguing against. Rather, in the general sense of things, ought you to make a rape joke? Hang on to your hats. If your joke promotes rape, don't tell it. Rape is bad, let's all be very clear. If your joke stigmatizes sexual assault survivors, don't tell that joke either. Just don't. If your joke uses an instance of rape as a springboard, as shock value, without saying anything particularly constructive, consider to what extent you are appropriating and devaluing the experiences of survivors for your own purposes.
I was raped by a doctor, which is, so bittersweet for a Jewish girl.
If your joke mentions rape at all, frankly, give your audience fair warning. If you don't, you are likely to imply that rape is a topic you ought to discuss freely in any setting, or at the very least, you'll invoke someone else's trauma without their consent. If your joke is boldly delivered or otherwise unambiguously competent, consider the extent to which you are conveying yourself as either an or the authority on the subject. And I ought to do that now. I am not an authority on sexual assault, or frankly any of this. To be honest, I've just pooled all sorts of research from feminists and activists in academia and social movements and in the sphere of comedy itself to conjure for you what I hope is a handy list of lessons to take away. Consider, if you are a cis man, you are in the demographic by whom most rape is committed, and that may mean you ought to evaluate how your demographic discusses sexual assault and what you can do to subvert that in your joke. If you hearken too closely to actual sentiments about sexual assault, your joke is more likely to come across as unnerving than funny.
I play practical jokes on her constantly, though. I got her so good a few weeks ago. I replaced her pepper spray with silly string. Anyway, that night, she got raped.
If your joke reflects your own experience with sexual assault, consider that other survivors may not be prepared to cope with their assault in the same way as you, and that your comfort does not necessarily indicate theirs.
Because it's not like me, I'm trying to talk about sexual assault. It's not like that's a new topic in comedy. We've had rape jokes forever, but it's just like those jokes have usually been like, rape! That's the full joke.
If your joke speaks to trauma, make a point to convey to those without trauma that they ought not to pull your joke out of its established context. Better yet, construct it such that they can't pull your joke out of the context without losing what made it appealing. If your joke is intended for the internet, for an audience larger than you can imagine, I don't know what to tell you. You're going to hurt someone somewhere. Take precautions, play it by ear, and if you can stand it, maybe just don't tell the joke. Tell it to your friends. Tell it at an open mic night in a dingy bar to 5 people if you need to get it out of your system. Workshopping your comedy is important, I understand, but that practice ought not to be at anyone's expense. We have an innate desire to create as human beings. Capitalism isn't a particularly good system for fostering creativity, so more often than not, we have to make do with the time we have in the cracks and crevices between our jobs and obligations. And what come out of those moments usually are jokes. Jokes are a wildly accessible form of art that's accessible to anyone at any time. And jokes are the kinds of things that we've been practicing on and off for pretty much our entire lives. So when a joke of yours fails to land, when your creation is deemed invalid, that can be crushing, I understand. You deserve to express yourself, plain and simple, especially if you're trying to speak truth to power. If you're someone like me, who's made the kinds of jokes that can hurt, and the kinds of jokes that would alienate the people you are trying to make laugh in the first place, I hope you come away from this essay with an understanding that your intentions aren't amiss. Comedy's just a minefield, thrilling to traverse, but ultimately volatile after a single misstep. I put this at the end of our essay because to defend performers before defending the people whom they can hurt would be missing the point. Neither victims nor their allies are obligated under any circumstance to sympathize with performers in any meaningful way. I understand this has been a kind of pessimistic analysis of comedy as a rhetorical device, like it's been really grim, honestly, but I would never say that comedy isn't worth pursuing and learning from. And if you've made it this far, to the end, I reckon you feel the same.
Thank you so much for watching. Remember, this show is brought to you by other viewers just like you, so consider becoming a sponsor on our Patreon page. You can follow us both on Twitter and watch our Twitch stream every Friday night. We'll see you next time.